The terminal buzzed with the familiar rhythm of travel. Rolling suitcases clicked against the tiled floor. Voices layered over the announcements, echoing from the overhead speakers, and the scent of burnt coffee drifted from the nearby cafe. It was just another ordinary afternoon in an American airport, where hundreds of travelers hurried toward gates, each with a private destination, a private story. Among them was Claire Donovan. She moved quietly, without fanfare, dressed in dark. Jeans, a simple gray hoodie, and sneakers that had seen better days. Her carry-on bag was practical, not stylish, and she carried herself with a certain relaxed poise, the kind of presence that didn't call attention, yet made her appear quietly assured. She had flown countless times, though most of her earlier. Flights were in very different aircraft, under circumstances far less predictable than a commercial trip across the country. Today, however, she was just another passenger heading home after a long week of training sessions and briefings in Washington. D.C. Claire scanned her boarding pass at the gate, offering the attendant a polite nod, and walked the jet bridge. The familiar metallic clunk underfoot brought her back to memories she usually kept tucked away. She shook them off with a steady breath and stepped onto the aircraft. The cabin was filling quickly, passengers fumbling with overhead bins, others already settled with books or neck pillows. Row 12 was midway down, an aisle seat. She slid in easily, tucking her bag beneath the seat in front of her and pulling out a pair of earbuds. Unlike many around her, she didn't scramble for space in the overhead bin. Years of travel taught her efficiency. Everything essential was within reach. She leaned back and exhaled. For once, she welcomed the anonymity of this flight. No responsibilities. Beyond sitting still for a few hours. No one here knew her past, nor the hours she had once logged in cockpits at 30,000 feet, scanning horizons in silence, listening to the chatter of radios. That was a different life, and on commercial. Flights she was content to be a passenger, invisible in the crowd. Families bustled around her, children negotiating with parents over snacks and tablets. A man across the aisle tapped away at a laptop with the determined focus of someone racing a deadline. A college student near the window took selfies, sending them off before the plane left the ground. It was all so ordinary, so expected. The flight attendants moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency. Smiles, greetings, reminders to step aside for boarding passengers. Claire offered a small smile back when one of them checked her row. She noticed the subtle weariness in the attendant's eyes, a kind of fatigue that came from countless flights and long hours. Claire recognized it. She'd seen the same in her own reflection once, after days in the air without real rest. When the safety briefing began, Claire half listened. She knew every word by heart, even though she wasn't required to. Years ago, she'd been the one responsible for explaining procedures to others, in far more dire settings than a cabin filled with holiday travelers. The click of the seatbelt echoed around her, and she tugged hers snug without thinking, a reflex ingrained after years of training. The engine's whirred, a low vibration running through the cabin as the plane began to push back. Claire closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the change in pitch, the familiar escalation of power as the engines roared to life. To her, these sounds weren't background noise. They were information, telling her about thrust, balance, and the condition of the aircraft. Even now, as a civilian passenger, she couldn't quite shut off that part of her brain. But she reminded herself, not today. Today she wasn't on duty. She was here to rest, to travel like anyone else. She slipped her earbuds in, letting soft music drown out the mental analysis. As the aircraft taxied to the runway, a child squealed, excitedly near the back, pressing his face to the window. The college student groaned dramatically, already annoyed by the noise. Claire smirked faintly, the ordinary dynamics of strangers packed into a metal tube, all tolerating one another for the sake of reaching somewhere else. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Flight 482. We'll be heading westbound this afternoon with an estimated flight time of just under 4 hours. Weather looks favorable, and we should have a smooth ride for most of the way. Please sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight." Claire felt the familiar push against her chest as the plane accelerated down the runway, the rumble intensifying, until the wheels left the ground. The cabin tilted slightly, and the force pressed her deeper into the seat as the city below shrank rapidly. She glanced sideways, watching buildings become specks, rivers turning into silver threads. The seatbelt sign remained on as the plane climbed. Passengers adjusted, some pulling out books, others already closing their eyes. The man across the aisle cursed quietly as turbulence caused him to misspell something on his screen. Claire tilted, her head back, and let the steady hum of the engine soothe her. By the time the seatbelt sign chimed off, she was already halfway asleep. The rhythm of flight had always lulled her. Even after years of training, missions, and tense operations, the act of being airborne, steady, constant, carried in odd comfort. She adjusted her hoodie, tugged the hood over her head, and allowed herself to drift. No one paid her any special attention. To the passengers around her, she was simply a tired traveler catching a nap mid-journey. Nothing about her suggested the hours of combat flight training, the maneuvers at high altitude, the nights spent guiding missions through storms. Here, she was just the woman in row 12, blending seamlessly into the fabric of anonymous travelers. For the next hour, the cabin carried the gentle rhythm of an ordinary flight. Attendants rolled carts down the aisles, offering drinks and snacks. Laughter bubbled from a group of college friends 2 rows back. A businesswoman flipped through, slides on her tablet, whispering a presentation under her breath. Claire barely stirred. Her music shifted through playlists, but her breathing stayed steady, her body slack with the rare ease of someone finally off duty. She didn't notice the subtle tension building in the cockpit, or the flight attendants exchanging glances as they received updates through the intercom system. She was asleep, unaware that this ordinary flight was about to turn into anything but. The cabin lights had dimmed to a soft glow, creating an atmosphere of quiet routine. Most passengers had settled in, drinks resting on tray tables, magazines half open, earbuds tucked in, and blankets pulled up to shoulders. The flight had reached cruising altitude, and the earlier restlessness of takeoff had given way to the usual rhythm of air travel. Claire, still nestled in row 12, was in a light sleep. Her body leaned slightly toward the aisle, head tipped back against the seat. The low drone of the engines and her music, faint through earbuds, created a cocoon that sheltered her from the movement around her. She stirred once or twice when a flight attendant brushed by with the cart, but otherwise she remained undisturbed, as if insulated from the world. Then came the sound that woke her, not turbulence, not the clatter of trays, but the sudden shift in the captain's voice. The intercom crackled to life, and the cabin quieted instinctively. Every passenger had learned, through hundreds of flights or maybe only a few, that when the captain spoke mid-flight, it usually meant information, altitude, weather, or arrival updates. This time, however, the tone carried something different. "Ladies and gentlemen." The captain's voice was steady, but under the steadiness was an edge, something urgent carefully restrained. "If there is a licensed pilot on board, please make yourself known to a member of the crew immediately." A ripple of confusion spread through the rows. Passengers looked up from screens and books, exchanging startled glances. The words hung in the air, heavy, unnatural. A request like that was not part of routine announcements. In the row ahead of Claire, a woman frowned, whispering to her husband. Did he say a pilot? Why would he need that? Her voice trembled with curiosity that leaned toward fear. Across the aisle, the businessman with the laptop froze mid-keystroke. He looked around, scanning the cabin as though someone would suddenly stand up, hand raised like a student in class. The college student by the window tugged out an earbud, eyes wide. Children quieted as parents shushed them, their own attention captured by the intercom's message. A moment later, the captain repeated the call, this time shorter, clipped. If there are any licensed pilots on board, please ring your call button now. The flight attendants immediately shifted. Their calm but brisk movement betrayed urgency. One hurried to the front of the cabin, pressing a button near the galley phone. Another scanned the rows, eyes sharp, searching for anyone who might respond. Passengers watched them with growing unease. Claire stirred fully awake now, blinking against the dim cabin lights. She pulled out an earbud, certain she'd misheard. But the whispers around her confirmed it. The captain had asked for a pilot. Not a doctor, not a nurse, which was rare enough, but still understandable. A pilot. Her heartbeat quickened. She sat still, listening, her training instincts stirring in the background, even though she hadn't yet moved. Years of discipline had taught her to assess first, act second. The cabin, however, was buzzing with speculation. What does that mean? Is something wrong with the plane? A man in row 14 asked aloud. Maybe the captain's sick, someone replied, half joking, though their voice carried unease. The attendants hurried back down the aisles, eyes darting left and right. Their movements were polite but clipped, the kind of efficiency designed to mask urgency without alarming passengers. Yet the passengers could tell this was not normal. Claire's mind shifted into quiet calculation. She knew scenarios where such a call might be made. A sudden medical emergency in the cockpit, an incapacitated crew member, a technical situation where backup was needed. None of them were ordinary, but all of them were serious. Still, she stayed silent, her identity hidden for the moment. She wanted to see how the crew handled it, how immediate the situation appeared. She could tell, by their pace and the captain's tone, that this wasn't a drill. The businessman across the aisle leaned into the aisle, flagging down a flight attendant as she passed. "What's happening?" he demanded, his voice louder. Then intended, "Why does the captain need another pilot?" The attendant's professional smile flickered briefly, betraying strain. "We just need to verify if any passengers on board have flight experience," she said carefully, moving past before further questions could trap her. Her response did little to ease nerves. Children's questions rose. "Mommy, what's wrong? Daddy, are we going to crash?" Parents tried to soothe them with quiet assurances, though their own eyes betrayed uncertainty. The intercom chimed again, not from the captain this time, but from a flight attendant. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. We're requesting." This information purely as a precaution. Precaution. The word was meant to soothe, but to the seasoned ear, it was a buffer word, chosen precisely because the real details couldn't be shared openly. Claire recognized that immediately. It meant something significant had occurred, something the crew was trying to manage without stirring panic. She adjusted her seat upright, tugging her hoodie back. Her mind, sharpened from years of training, clicked into quiet readiness. Though she had promised herself she was done with the high-pressure roles, that part of her never truly left. From her vantage point, in row 12, she could see one of the attendants crouch beside a passenger in row 8, speaking quietly. She couldn't hear the words, but she saw the shake of the passenger's head, the apologetic shrug. No, not a pilot. The attendant moved on, asking others discreetly. The businessman across the aisle shook his head emphatically when asked, though he muttered afterward, "I've flown Cessnas once or twice. That doesn't count, right?" It didn't, Claire thought silently. Not here, not at this altitude. not with hundreds of lives on board. She was beginning to sense the urgency herself now. If the captain had asked twice, and the attendants were combing the cabin, the situation was real. She weighed her choice carefully. Revealing herself meant explaining who she was, what she could do, and why she could be trusted. To passengers, she was just a woman in casual clothes, half asleep moments ago. To the crew, however, her credentials would matter. For now, though, she sat still. Her eyes followed the attendants, her ears tuned for the intercom. She needed one more confirmation before stepping forward. And then it came. The captain's voice returned, tighter this time, the control beginning to fray. I repeat, if there are any licensed pilots on this aircraft, please identify yourselves immediately. The words struck through the cabin like a blade. Passengers shifted uncomfortably, their nervous energy rising. Whispers turned into audible questions. Someone near the back asked bluntly, "Is the plane in trouble?" The attendants, still calm on the surface, moved faster. One pressed the intercom and repeated the reassurance. But even that voice cracked, betraying strain. Claire felt the change like a physical shift. The balance of the flight, ordinary, predictable, anonymous, was tilting. She inhaled slowly, steadying herself the way she had countless times before entering a cockpit under pressure. She had hoped to remain unnoticed this trip, to be nothing more than the woman in row 12. But the situation was unraveling, and she knew, as surely as she knew her own heartbeat, that this wasn't going to pass without her. She sat forward in her seat, earbuds coiled into her pocket, eyes locked on the nearest attendant moving quickly down the aisle. It was time to decide whether to stay hidden or stand up. The cabin was no longer an ordinary place of quiet travel. Attention hung over the rows like invisible smoke. The moment the captain repeated his plea for a licensed pilot, the passengers shifted from mild curiosity to open unease. Conversations grew louder, overlapping, each voice carrying fear disguised as speculation. What could be happening? A woman near the back asked her seatmate. Maybe the autopilot broke, came the whispered reply. That doesn't happen, does it? Planes don't just need other pilots. The more people speculated, the heavier the atmosphere became. Mothers hushed their children. Elderly couples clutched each other's hands. A teenager leaned over the aisle and whispered dramatically, "I think the captain's sick." The attendants worked quickly, moving with urgent politeness. They avoided giving specifics, instead repeating phrases like, "We're just confirming information," or "It's purely precautionary." But their tight smiles and hurried pace betrayed more than they realized. Claire saw through it instantly. Years of assessing people under stress had given her an eye for the small giveaways, the faint tremble in a hand, the clipped edge in a voice, the darting glances toward the cockpit. Claire sat upright now, fully awake, the music silent in her earbuds, though they still rested around her neck. She hadn't moved yet, but her thoughts raced with clarity. If the co-pilot had collapsed, it would explain everything. In military aviation, they had drilled for pilot incapacitation countless times. One pilot slumps over, the other has to take full control, often with no warning. In a two-person cockpit, losing one instantly doubled the burden. She imagined the captain, hands steady on the yoke, glancing sideways to see a co-pilot motionless. A cold rush went through her at the thought. Even with experience, that scenario could rattle the best of them. And on a commercial flight with nearly 200 lives in the cabin, the stakes were enormous. Row by row, the attendants asked. Some passengers laughed nervously and shook their heads. A few raised hands tentatively, admitting they had taken flying lessons years ago, only to withdraw when the attendant asked pointedly, "Do you hold a current license to operate commercial or military aircraft?" The answer, of course, was no. Claire watched them move closer, her pulse quickening. She hadn't planned to reveal herself, not yet. But the longer she waited, the more urgent the captain's voice sounded. His third announcement had carried. That edge of strain, the mask of calm beginning to crack. The attendant in her aisle reached row 10, crouching beside a man who admitted, "I flew recreationally, but it's been years. I wouldn't know what to do with something this size." She offered a tight smile and moved on. Claire leaned back in her seat, staring at the fabric of the headrest in front of her. The decision pressed heavier with every second. She could remain silent, let the crew scramble, hope the captain held on until landing. But the chances of that were slim if his plea for help was this desperate. She glanced sideways at the businessman, still tapping at his laptop nervously. He muttered to himself, "God, I hope someone says yes." Claire inhaled deeply. Her old commander's voice echoed in her head, a phrase drilled into her bones. "When you're the one who can act, you don't wait for someone else." The attendant reached her row. "Excuse me, ma'am," she asked gently. "Do you have any flight experience?" Claire looked up at her, meeting her eyes. For a split second, she hesitated, the old instinct to remain anonymous tugging her back. But she knew there was no time for that. She nodded slowly. "Yes," she said. Her voice was calm, but steady enough to be heard. "I do." The attendant blinked, clearly not expecting the answer. "Are you a licensed pilot?" She pressed. "I am," Claire replied. She straightened in her seat. "United States Air Force. 10 years flight experience, multiple aircraft types. I'm currently certified." The attendant's professional mask cracked for the briefest moment, relief flashing across her face before she recovered. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Please stay here a moment. I'll inform the captain immediately." As she hurried forward, Claire felt the eyes of those around her. The businessman across the aisle froze, his laptop forgotten, staring at her as though she had just transformed into someone entirely new. The college student at the window leaned forward, whispering, "She's a pilot?" loud enough for 2 rows to hear. Within seconds, whispers spread. Row by row, the news traveled, reshaped in each retelling. "She's military." "She said she's certified." "The woman in row 12's a pilot." Claire felt the weight of those eyes, but didn't flinch. She had been under scrutiny before, under far more dangerous circumstances. If anything, the murmurs only sharpened her focus. The intercom chimed. "Again, cabin crew, please prepare for a briefing." The captain's voice was brisk, almost clipped. Moments later, the attendant returned, leaning down toward Claire. "The captain needs you in the cockpit immediately." Claire unbuckled her seatbelt in one smooth motion. She rose from row 12 with quiet decisiveness, pulling her hoodie tighter around her shoulders. Passengers watched as she stepped into the aisle, a mix of hope and disbelief on their faces. As she followed the attendant toward the cockpit, Claire's thoughts steadied. The old rhythm returned, the mental shift into mission mode. Assess. Plan, act. The uncertainty in the cabin faded from her awareness. Ahead was the cockpit, and with it, the reality of whatever situation awaited her. She didn't know what condition the co-pilot was in, or what technical issues the captain was facing. But she knew this. She had the skills to help. And right now, that was what mattered. The cockpit door loomed closer, guarded by another attendant who gave her a quick once-over before stepping aside. Claire nodded once, her jaw set, her mind already preparing for the unknown. Behind her, the passengers whispered, their voices a mixture of fear and awe. To them, she was no longer just the woman in row 12. She was the answer to the captain's desperate call. And as the door closed, behind her, the weight of 200 lives pressed onto her shoulders. She was no longer a passenger. She was a pilot again. The cockpit door shut behind her with a firm click, sealing Claire into a world far removed from the quiet anonymity of row 12. For passengers, that door symbolized mystery, safety, and authority. For Claire, it was like stepping back into a life she thought she had put away. The cockpit smelled of warm electronics and recycled air, familiar in a way that sent a shiver of recognition through her. Panels glowed softly, blinking in green and amber. The captain sat in his seat, shoulders tense, one hand gripping the yoke with white-knuckled intensity. His eyes darted to her, wide with relief and strain. Beside him, the co-pilot slumped motionless, head tilted against the headrest, an oxygen mask pressed loosely to his face. His chest rose and fell unevenly, alive, but in no condition to fly. "Thank God," the captain breathed. His voice carried exhaustion, as if he had been holding his breath for far too long. "They said you're certified?" "Yes," Claire replied firmly, sliding into the vacant right-hand seat. Her voice was calm, but her pulse hammered with adrenaline. "United States Air Force. F-16s, C-130s, and several hours logged on civilian sims. I can help." The captain exhaled sharply, the faintest crack of relief breaking his tension. Co-pilot collapsed 20 minutes ago, likely cardiac. "I've been managing alone, but with this weather system ahead and a medical emergency on board, I can't juggle both." Claire's eyes flicked to the instruments. Altitude steady. Autopilot engaged, but crosswinds ahead were already causing subtle deviations. Her hands itched to move across the controls, to reassert precision. She forced herself to pause, to gather the full picture. "Has medical been called for him?" she asked, glancing at the co-pilot. "Yes, flight attendants are tending. But he's out for now. We need to divert." Claire nodded. "Agreed. What's your nearest alternate?" The captain rattled off the details, and without hesitation, Claire took the radio. "Center, this is Flight 482. We are declaring an onboard medical emergency. Request immediate vectors to alternate." Her voice was steady, precise, the voice of someone who had done this before, countless times, though never on this exact kind of stage. Air traffic control responded immediately, issuing headings. Claire's fingers moved across the panel with muscle memory that returned like a tide, flipping switches, confirming settings. The captain glanced at her, his shoulders easing fractionally as he realized he no longer bore the burden alone. "You weren't listed as crew," he said, almost conversational in his shock, even as he focused on descent prep. "I wasn't," she answered simply, adjusting a dial. "Row 12. Wasn't planning to fly today." The captain let out a short, almost disbelieving laugh. "Hell of a day to change your mind." For the first time, Claire allowed herself the smallest smile. But behind it, she felt the weight of the truth. She hadn't told him everything. Not about why she left the Air Force. Not about the accident that haunted her. Not about the nights when she'd sworn she'd never set foot in a cockpit again. Those were parts of her identity she kept hidden, folded neatly away like uniforms in a trunk. To the world outside, she was simply Claire Donovan, trainer and consultant. But here, with the roar of engines surrounding her and a captain leaning on her presence, she was Captain Donovan again. The intercom chimed, and a flight attendant's voice filled the cockpit. "Captain, the cabin is growing restless. They're asking questions." "I'll make an announcement," the captain replied, reaching for the handset. But Claire touched his arm. "I'll do it," she said softly. He blinked at her, then nodded. Claire took the handset, pressing the button. The cabin fell silent. On the other side, as her voice carried through the speakers, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Claire Donovan speaking. Some of you may have seen me leave row 12. I am a licensed military pilot, and I'm assisting the captain. We do have a medical situation on board, but the aircraft is under full control. We'll be diverting to the nearest suitable airport, and everything is being handled. Please remain calm and follow the crew's instructions." Her words rolled through the cabin, steady and deliberate, crafted to cut through panic. In row 12, where her seat now sat empty, passengers looked at one another with dawning relief. The businessman who had once muttered nervously shook his head in amazement. The college student whispered, "She really is a pilot." In the cockpit, Claire hung up the handset. The captain gave her a look, respect, mingled with curiosity. "You've done this before," he said. "Yes," Claire answered simply. But even as she spoke, the weight of her hidden identity pressed against her. Few knew the real reasons she had left the Air Force, the classified missions that had ended with close calls, the loss of a wingman she couldn't save, the long nights, staring at ceilings, replaying decisions she would never undo. Flying had once defined her entire life, but it had also taken parts of her she could never reclaim. And yet, here she was, slipping seamlessly back into the role, as though she had never left. The aircraft rocked slightly in turbulence, snapping her back to the present. Claire's hands steadied the controls instinctively. The captain glanced at her, saw her composure, and nodded approvingly. "You've got this," he said. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her focus was absolute now. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had boarded as a passenger, hoping to be invisible, to leave behind the identity that had once consumed her. But when the call came, that hidden identity was exactly what the flight needed. And for the first time in years, as her hands guided the aircraft through a bumpy patch of sky, Claire felt something stir deep inside her. Not fear, not guilt, but a reminder of who she truly was when it mattered most. Her hidden identity wasn't just hidden. It was alive. The cabin of Flight 482 had settled into a tense silence after Claire's announcement. Her voice, steady and confident, had reassured many, but the weight of what she had revealed hung thick in the air. The woman in row 12, who had boarded, quietly, hoodie drawn, eyes closed against the world, was no longer invisible. She was now the focal point of 200 strangers' hopes. Behind the cockpit door, Claire focused entirely on the task at hand. The captain had briefed her quickly. The co-pilot's condition was worsening, though he was still breathing with oxygen support. Medical staff would meet them on the ground, but the descent and landing would fall heavily on the captain, unless Claire carried more of the load. She leaned slightly forward in her seat, studying the glowing instrument panel. "You've been managing alone for 20 minutes?" she asked. The captain nodded, his jaw tight. "Autopilot's doing its job, but I need someone monitoring. Turbulence is picking up ahead, and a TC wants us down sooner rather than later." "I can't do both." Claire absorbed the information swiftly. Her training had drilled her to handle chaos in increments. Gather, assess, act. She could see the strain in the captain's posture, the slight tremor in his left hand as it hovered near the throttle. He was holding steady, but the burden of flying solo with a full cabin and a sick co-pilot had pushed him to the edge of endurance. "All right," she said evenly. "I'll take monitoring and comms. You focus on flying. I'll back you on corrections." The captain gave a curt nod, relief flickering in his expression. Without hesitation, she reached across the panel, adjusting settings with practiced ease. Fingers flicked over knobs, checking altitude, reviewing the diversion vectors issued by a TC. Her voice slipped into a professional cadence as she keyed the mic. "Center, Flight 482, confirming vectors to alternate. Descending at your discretion." The response came swiftly, clipped and efficient. "Flight 482, roger. Descend and maintain flight level 240. Expect approach vectors in 15. Claire repeated the clearance, adjusting the autopilot dial smoothly. The aircraft responded with a gentle shift, beginning its gradual descent. The captain exhaled again, tension bleeding from his shoulders. He glanced at her, the faintest trace of gratitude in his eyes. "Feels like I've got my right hand back." Claire didn't respond with words. She simply nodded, her focus laser sharp. On the panel, her presence alone was answer enough. Meanwhile, in the cabin, passengers strained to understand what was happening. Most had caught her announcement, but with no further updates, whispers filled the silence. She sounded calm. A woman in row 20 whispered, like she knew exactly what to do. "Air Force," she said. Another replied, "That's serious, right? Not just a hobby pilot." The businessman across from row 12 leaned back in his seat, staring at the cockpit door with an expression that hovered between disbelief and admiration. "Imagine that," he muttered to no one in particular. All this time she was sitting. "They're like the rest of us." And now, children quieted, sensing the shift in the adults around them. Even those who didn't fully understand could feel the atmosphere had changed. The panic that had bubbled earlier began to settle into something steadier, cautious trust. Back in the cockpit, turbulence rattled the plane. The nose dipped slightly before stabilizing. Claire's hand shot instinctively to the yoke, not to override but to steady, a silent reassurance to the captain that she was there. "You've flown heavies before?" he asked through clenched teeth, adjusting for the crosswind. "C-130s, she confirmed. "Different handling, but the principles translate." He gave a quick nod. "Good enough." She didn't tell him she'd logged more hours than she cared to count, that she'd flown through storms over the middle, east with radio chatter blaring and ground fire waiting below. She didn't mention that her hands remembered every control instinctively, even after years away. This wasn't the time for stories. It was the time for action. As they continued, descending, she monitored engine readings, cross-checking against approach data. Her calm, steady voice relayed details to a TC. The controller on the other end sounded reassured by the professional cadence, not the panicked tones of a crew under duress, but the clipped precision of someone who belonged at the controls. "Flight 482. Expect vectors for runway 27. Winds variable at 12. Light rain in the vicinity. Emergency services will be standing by." Claire acknowledged and turned to the captain. "We'll be stable on 27. Winds are within tolerance. Nothing we can't handle." The captain cracked a brief smile despite the tension. "You sound like you've said that before. More times than I can count." The aircraft shuddered again as the turbulence thickened. Claire steadied herself, eyes darting between instruments and horizon. Her mind worked like a machine, cataloging each data point, each flicker of light. She wasn't just assisting. She was re-inhabiting the identity she had buried, the one she had promised herself she wouldn't need again. But the moment demanded it. Outside the cockpit, the world continued unaware. Families waiting at the arrival gate, airport staff preparing for routine landings. None of them knew that inside the descending jet, a woman who had boarded as an anonymous passenger was now sharing command of the flight. In the cabin, the flight attendants moved quietly, securing carts, calming passengers. One of them paused, near row 12, staring at the empty seat with a kind of reverence. She whispered to a colleague, "She's up there right now." Can you believe that? Passengers overheard and exchanged glances. Whispers turned to murmurs, and murmurs to quiet. Admiration. Some smiled faintly, others simply sat back, grateful. The fear hadn't disappeared, but it had shifted. Where panic had once grown, there was now trust in the stranger who had stepped forward. In the cockpit, the captain adjusted heading slightly. His breathing was steadier now, his focus sharper. Claire could see how her presence had lifted the crushing weight from him. He was still flying, but he was no longer alone. She glanced at him, her tone professional yet steady. "I'll handle the approach callouts. You keep your hands on the bird. I'll back you on checklists." "Copy that," he said with the ease of a man finally supported. And so they worked, a seamless rhythm, as though they had flown together for years. Callouts, corrections, acknowledgments. Claire's voice filled the cockpit with calm authority, each word reminding the captain that he was not carrying this burden alone. Her step forward had changed everything. For the passengers, it meant reassurance. For the crew, it meant balance restored. For the captain, it meant survival of a situation that had been tipping toward disaster. And for Claire, it meant confronting the identity she thought she had left behind forever. She had boarded the plane to be no one, to disappear into the rows like any other traveler. But fate had asked her to step forward. And when it did, she realized that no matter how far she tried to run from the skies, they would always find her. The woman in row 12 was gone. In her place sat Captain Claire. Donovan, pilot once again. The descent into the storm was more than physical. It was emotional, layered with memory, fear, and responsibility. Claire had stepped forward into the cockpit, not just as a helper, but as someone returning to a world she thought she'd closed forever. Now, as rain streaked across the windshield and turbulence jostled the aircraft, she felt the familiar weight of command settling onto her shoulders, heavy but not unwelcome. The cockpit was a symphony of sound and light, engines humming, autopilot chimes pinging, the steady murmur of air traffic control feeding updates through the headset. Claire adjusted her earpiece, her eyes flicking across the instrument panel. Numbers, dials, gauges, the language she knew better than her own handwriting. "Speed steady at 250, she reported. Her tone was clipped, professional. "Roger," the captain replied, hands steady on the yoke. He looked more composed now, his earlier desperation tempered by the knowledge that someone capable sat beside him. "You've got a good scan," he added. Claire didn't answer with words. She simply kept her focus locked on the panel, monitoring the descent path. Flying was as much instinct as training, and hers hadn't dulled, not after thousands of hours in the air. The co-pilot still slumped beside them, unconscious, his breathing ragged but steady under the oxygen mask. A flight attendant had slipped in earlier to check, her eyes flicking nervously between the fallen officer and Claire before she retreated back to the cabin. The sight of one pilot down and another stepping in had rippled through the cabin like wildfire, sparking both fear and reassurance in equal measure. Claire blocked that out. She knew the psychology of passengers. She had flown troops into war zones, men and women whose courage cracked once the wheels left the ground. A calm voice, a steady hand, and a competent presence were as vital as oxygen. That was her role now. "Center, Flight 482 descending through 18,000. She called into the mic, her voice crisp. "Flight 482, roger. Expect vectors in 3 minutes. Maintain heading 270, came the reply. She acknowledged, then glanced at the weather radar. Storm cells blossomed in shades of green and yellow, with angry red clusters just south of their path. She tapped the screen lightly. "We'll skirt the edge here," she noted. "Vectors look clean, but if this cell grows, we'll need a 5-degree correction north." The captain looked over, eyebrow raised. "You've done this before." Claire's lips pressed into the faintest smile. "A few times." Outside, lightning flickered in the distance, illuminating the dark underbelly of the clouds. The aircraft shuddered again, jolting several hundred feet before the autopilot compensated. Claire steadied her breathing, letting the rhythm of her training take over. "You ever flown commercial heavies before?" The captain asked suddenly, perhaps as much to steady his own nerves as to fill the silence. C-130s mostly, she replied, eyes never leaving the instruments. Different mission profile, but comparable systems. And fighters. He gave a low whistle. Fighters. You're overqualified for this seat then. She allowed herself a short laugh. It's been a while. What she didn't say. The last time she'd sat in a cockpit like this, it hadn't. Ended cleanly. She remembered alarms screaming in her headset, the sky spinning as she wrestled control from an ailing system, the gut-punch realization that her wingman wasn't answering. That was the night she told herself she was done. No more risks, no more lives hanging on her decisions. And yet, here she was. The intercom buzzed, and a flight attendant's voice broke into the cockpit. Captain, passengers are asking for updates. Should we say anything more? The captain hesitated, eyes flicking to Claire. She nodded once. I'll take it. He handed her the handset, and Claire pressed the button. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Claire Donovan again. We're descending now toward our alternate airport. Conditions are being managed carefully, and the captain and I working together to ensure a safe landing. Please keep your seatbelts fastened. Cabin crew will assist you with anything you need. The calm cadence of her voice spread through the cabin like a balm. Passengers sat back a little straighter, reassured by the confidence of someone who spoke not with uncertainty, but with authority. They didn't know her past, but they trusted her now. Hanging up, she returned her attention to the instruments. Descent through 14,000, she noted. Speed within limits. The captain glanced sideways, studying her briefly. I have to ask, why row 12? Why not still in the cockpit, day after day? Her fingers hovered over the throttle, adjusting slightly. She kept her eyes forward. Sometimes the sky takes more than it gives back, she said quietly. He didn't push further. The cockpit was a place for precision, not confession. But her words hung there, a glimpse into the truth she rarely shared. ATC broke the silence. Flight 482, turn left heading 250, descend to 6,000, expect vectors for final. Claire acknowledged, her voice crisp as she relayed the commands. She and the captain worked seamlessly now, each movement mirrored, each call-out confirmed. They had become a team in less than an hour, necessity forging a bond stronger than months of routine flying could. The rain thickened, pelting against the windshield. Wipers swiped rhythmically, barely keeping pace with the downpour. The runway lay ahead, somewhere beneath the sheets of water and cloud, invisible for now. Claire leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Keep your scan up, she reminded softly. Trust the instruments. We'll break through soon. The captain nodded, his breathing steady. Her words anchored him, kept his focus sharp. He wasn't alone anymore. In the cabin, passengers felt the turbulence and clutched armrests, whispering prayers, holding hands. But many remembered her voice, the assurance she had given them. A woman in row 12 who had risen, unassuming and calm, when the captain called. Their fear hadn't vanished, but it was tempered by belief in her presence. In the cockpit, Claire's hands moved swiftly across the panel, adjusting altitude, confirming glide path. The airport appeared faintly on the navigation screen. A beacon pulling them in. This is it, she murmured. Approach in 5. The captain exhaled, gripping the yoke firmly. Let's bring her home. Claire placed one hand lightly on the controls, steadying, reassuring. The storm outside might rage, but inside the cockpit, calm had returned. She had entered not as a passenger, but as a pilot. And though the years had tried to bury that part of her, the skies had claimed her once again. The descent steepened. The runway waited. And Claire Donovan, once hidden in row 12, now sat exactly where she belonged. The storm did not relent. Sheets of rain slashed across the windshield like 1,000 silver threads, and the aircraft trembled in the grip of turbulent air. Claire Donovan sat firmly in the right-hand seat, headset snug, voice steady as she. Coordinated with air traffic control. The captain handled the yoke, his knuckles white, but Claire's presence steadied him. Together, they had shifted from strangers to co-pilots bound by necessity. Flight 482. Turn right heading 240. Descend to 3000. Cleared for ILS approach runway 36. The controller's voice crackled. Claire responded instantly, her tone crisp. 240, 3000, cleared ILS 36. Flight 482. She adjusted the autopilot settings, her fingers moving with practiced ease. The captain risked a glance at her. A calm in her voice was contagious. You've done this 1,000 times, haven't you? More than that, she said softly, scanning the instruments. But it never feels routine. Lightning split the clouds, illuminating the cockpit in stark white. The plane jolted downward, a pocket of air dropping them hundreds of feet in seconds. Gasps echoed faintly from the cabin behind them, but Claire kept her eyes locked on the artificial horizon. Correcting, she said, her hand steady on the throttle. Back on glide slope. Hold her here. The captain obeyed, adjusting trim, following her cues. His nerves still twitched, but her confidence gave him something to anchor to. Inside the cabin, fear simmered. Passengers clutched armrests, whispered prayers, or sat rigid with eyes closed. The story had spread. The woman for row 12, the one who had stood when no one else did, was in the cockpit now. Even without knowing the details, they felt the shift. Courage often flowed unseen, but it radiated when needed most. Claire's voice came again, calm over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we're on final approach. Conditions are challenging, but everything is under control. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We'll be on the ground shortly. The tone of her voice carried what the words could not. Confidence. It washed through the cabin like a quiet promise, and people breathed easier. Back in the cockpit, the ground approached on radar, though the runway was still hidden in a wall of rain. Claire adjusted flaps incrementally, her movements fluid. Flaps 15, now 25, she instructed. The captain executed without hesitation. The aircraft responded sluggishly, buffeted by crosswinds. Claire's eyes flicked between the glide slope indicator and the altimeter. Precision was everything now. At this stage, even small deviations could snowball into disaster. You're drifting right, she warned, her voice low but firm. Correct with rudder. Good. Hold it steady. The captain obeyed, sweat beading on his forehead. You're a natural commander, he muttered. Not command, she corrected softly. Just survival. The storm roared, rain hammering. The fuselage like an unrelenting drum. Visibility was nearly zero, the runway lights still swallowed by cloud and water. Claire leaned forward, scanning, willing them to appear. Altitude 1,000, she called. On glide path. Keep her centered. The captain's breathing quickened. His grip on the yoke was iron, his muscles tense. Claire noticed and reached out, steadying the controls with her left hand. Her touch was light but grounding. Breathe, she reminded him. Let the plane fly. Don't fight her too much. He exhaled, shoulders loosening slightly. The aircraft responded. Better when guided, not forced. Claire's words, drawn from thousands of flight hours, cut through the storm louder than the thunder. 500, she said. Still on slope. Trust your instruments. The runway's there, even if you don't see it yet. The cockpit felt suspended between chaos and calm, storm and steel. The co-pilot remained unconscious, still slumped to the side, but the partnership that mattered now was between Claire and the captain. Then, faint at first, two lights pierced the storm. Claire leaned forward, her heart tightening. "Runway." "In sight," she confirmed, her voice sharp with relief. "Continue." The captain's eyes flicked up, locking on to the faint glowing lines. The runway stretched ahead, blurred but real. Claire called the remaining descent. 300, flaps full, speed steady. Keep her aligned. Winds buffeted them, trying to shove the plane sideways. The nose drifted, and alarms threatened to sound, but Claire's hand shot to the rudder pedals, correcting. "Don't chase it," she ordered. "Small inputs, that's it." Good. The ground rushed closer, rain still lashing. Passengers clung tighter to seats, unaware of the minute. Battles fought in the cockpit every second. 100, she called. Her voice was clear, unwavering. "Keep it steady. You've got this." The captain swallowed hard. You've got this," she repeated firmly, cutting through his doubt. Her eyes never left the runway. 50 feet. The lights of the runway glowed brighter now, shimmering in the rain. The nose dipped slightly. "Flare," she commanded. The captain pulled back gently. The aircraft's massive frame obeyed, nose lifting, descent rate easing. The wheels hovered feet above the slick asphalt. Then, contact. A heavy thud reverberated. As the landing gear met the runway, the tires sprayed water in twin jets. The aircraft bounced slightly, then settled. Claire pushed the throttles to idle, her hand guiding without hesitation. "Reverse thrust," she ordered. The captain complied, engines roaring in reverse. The plane slowed, vibrations rattling the cabin. Claire's eyes darted to the airspeed. 70 knots. 50. 30. Finally, calm. The aircraft slowed. To a crawl, rain still streaming, engines humming down. They had made it. In the cabin, silence reigned for a heartbeat. Then, as the realization rippled through, applause broke out. It was hesitant at first, then swelling into a thunderous ovation. Relief, gratitude, awe. Every clap carried all of it. The captain exhaled heavily, his hands trembling now that the danger had passed. He turned to Claire, eyes wide. "If you hadn't been here," she shook her head, cutting him off. "We were both here. That's what matters." But inside, she knew. Her instincts, her training, her refusal to falter, those had carried them through the storm. The aircraft taxied slowly, guided to safety. The storm still raged outside, but inside, peace had returned. Passengers held each other, tears streaming, some whispering prayers of thanks. And though few of them would ever know the depth of what happened in that cockpit, they would always remember the calm voice, the unseen hands that brought them home. Claire removed her headset, leaning back finally. The adrenaline ebbed, leaving exhaustion in its place. She looked once more at the rain-slick runway, then closed her eyes briefly. For years, she had told herself she was done with flying, done with responsibility. But tonight had reminded her of a truth she couldn't escape. She would always be a pilot, and when the skies called, she would answer. The engines wound down to a low hum as Flight 482 rolled slowly across the drenched tarmac. The storm still lashed the fuselage with sheets of rain, but inside the aircraft, there was a quiet unlike anything that had existed earlier in the night. The passengers, moments ago bracing for disaster, now sat in stunned relief. Some whispered thanks to God, some clutched hands, and some simply stared ahead, unable to process that they were alive, because one passenger in row 12 had stood when. The captain's desperate question had filled the cabin. Claire Donovan sat back in the co-pilot's seat, her headset resting around her neck. Her hands, so steady during the storm, finally trembled in the aftermath. She kept them folded on her lap, grounding herself in silence as the aircraft taxied toward the gate. The captain exhaled beside her, every ounce of tension in his body finally beginning to drain. "You saved this flight," he said hoarsely, breaking the silence. His voice cracked in a way she had not heard before, gratitude mixed with disbelief. Claire shook her head, her eyes fixed on the shimmering lights of the terminal through. "The rain. No," she corrected softly. "We saved it. Together." The captain wanted to argue, but her tone left no room. She wasn't one to seek recognition, he realized. She was someone who answered when the skies demanded it, then stepped back into the shadows. Behind them, a flight attendant poked her head into the cockpit. Her eyes glistened with tears that hadn't fallen. "The passengers. They're applauding," she whispered, as though speaking louder might break the fragile calm. "They know something happened. They don't know the details, but they know." Claire glanced back. Indeed, faint clapping echoed forward, hesitant but real. People needed to release their relief, to express gratitude the only way they could. The captain leaned back in his chair, shoulders heavy with exhaustion. "You should let them know who you are," he said. "They deserve to know." But Claire only offered a faint smile. "That's not why I stepped forward. They don't need to remember me. They just need to remember they made it home tonight." The words struck him. She had no interest in glory, only in ensuring strangers survived. It was a rare kind of humility, forged not in pride, but in purpose. The aircraft came to a final halt at the gate. Ground crews swarmed outside, their rain-slicked jackets glowing under floodlights. Emergency medical teams rushed to the forward door, summoned earlier for the stricken co-pilot, who remained unconscious but stable. Paramedics carefully eased him from the cockpit, their voices hushed but efficient. Claire slid from her seat, standing quietly as the medics worked. Her body ached from tension, her mind already retreating into the quiet corners she knew well. She didn't wait for praise. Instead, she slipped her jacket back over her shoulders, as if preparing to blend once more into anonymity. The captain noticed. "You're just going to walk out?" he asked, incredulous. She gave him a steady look. "That's what passengers do." And with that, she stepped into the aisle. Passengers craned their necks as she appeared, but she kept her gaze forward, her pace steady. A murmur spread, whispers darting from row to row. Some recognized her as the woman who had raised her hand. Others pieced together the story from fragments overheard. The atmosphere shifted as she passed, gratitude swelling like a tide. A man in row 8 stood awkwardly, then clapped. Soon others joined, until the narrow cabin filled with applause once more, louder this time, genuine and overwhelming. Tears streaked faces, strangers smiled through exhaustion, and the sound followed Claire down the aisle like a wave of reverence. She felt every clap, every thankful gaze, yet she did not bask in it. She only nodded politely, a faint smile on her lips, her humility unbroken. For her, the storm was over. Her duty had ended the moment the wheels touched the ground. As she reached the forward galley, the lead flight attendant touched her arm. "Ma'am," she said softly, her eyes shining. "I've worked 100 flights, but I'll never forget this one. Thank you." Claire squeezed her hand gently. "Take care of them. That's what matters." The door opened, rain-scented air rushing in. Passengers slowly filed out, some lingering to give her nods or quiet thanks. She accepted them all, but never let it turn into ceremony. Her heart was too heavy with memory for that. Outside, the storm began to break, clouds parting to reveal faint slivers of stars. Claire stepped onto the jet bridge, the fluorescent lights casting long shadows. The terminal ahead buzzed with anxious waiting families and airport staff. Yet she walked as though she were any other traveler, anonymous, unremarkable. The captain caught up behind her, his voice firm now. "Claire, I don't know if I'll ever see you again, but I'll never forget tonight." She turned, meeting his eyes with quiet sincerity. "You don't need to remember me. Just remember what you're capable of when it matters most." With that, she slipped into the terminal crowd. To most, she was simply a passenger disembarking. Late at night, hair damp from the storm, bags slung over her shoulder. Few would guess she had guided a commercial jet through chaos, that hundreds of lives owed their safety to her calm hands and steel will. But for those who knew, the captain, the crew, and a handful of observant passengers, her presence would be a story carried for years, told in hushed tones at family tables, shared in airport lounges, passed on as legend. She was asleep in row 12 when the captain asked if any pilots were on board. And she stood. Claire left the terminal without fanfare, the applause fading behind her. Outside, the air was cool and sharp, washed clean by the storm. She inhaled deeply, the smell of wet concrete grounding her. A line of taxis idled, drivers watching for fares, but she chose to walk instead, her boots splashing in shallow puddles. Every step away from the airport was a return to normalcy, or at least her version of it. She was not seeking recognition, nor headlines, nor the gratitude of strangers. What she carried with her was quieter, deeper, the knowledge that when fate demanded it, she had answered. And though the storm had passed, Claire knew storms would always come, in skies, in lives, in the unexpected hours when courage was tested. She did not fear them, because she was, and would always be, a pilot. And when the call came, she would rise from row 12 again,